What's one family saying or phrase you heard growing up that still sticks with you?
When Mom started talking about my sister's wedding, she was radiant in that way she always is when she's proud of someone she's convinced the world should admire, and she didn't waste a second before looking at me and asking, almost teasing, almost judgmental, "Your sister's wedding was perfect. When will it be your turn?" I forced a small smile, the kind that hides more than it reveals, and said, "It already happened. You just weren't there." The words hung in the air for a long moment that felt like hours, and the room froze in a way I hadn't expected, because even though I had thought this would shock them, I didn't anticipate just how still they would become. With my father staring at me like he had just seen a ghost, my sister's mouth slightly open, her carefully curated expression cracking for the first time, and my mother blinking rapidly as if she hadn't understood what I said, but couldn't bring herself to ignore it either. I don't know if it was the perfect timing, the tone in my voice, or just the truth in the way I said it, but I felt an immediate surge of satisfaction as I realized that for once I had turned the tables, that I had managed to insert a sharp, undeniable reality into a room that had spent decades feeding me the invisible label of always the one behind, the one who doesn't measure up, the one who is late for everything that matters. I had spent so long sitting there, pretending that it didn't hurt when my parents fussed over my sister's milestones, celebrated her choices, and made little, offhand comments about my life that were meant to sting, but were always delivered with a thin veil of love, that I didn't know whether to feel guilty for enjoying this moment or to savor it fully because finally, I was not invisible, I was not small, and for the first time in years, I had the upper hand. The day had started like any other family event where my presence was required but never fully acknowledged, where my sister got the attention I had been trained to quietly accept she deserved, and where I had mastered the art of fading into the background so well that my absence might have gone unnoticed if I hadn't made this calculated choice, this decision to take control of the narrative in the only way that mattered to me. My sister had spent weeks, maybe months, planning her wedding, making sure that every flower, every song, every word that passed between the officiant and the crowd was flawless, and I had watched quietly, pretending to care more than I actually did, nodding at the right moments, complimenting her endlessly while she basked in the glow of parental approval that was always freely given to her and rarely, if ever, extended to me. And I had been asked so many times about my own life, my own plans, my own non-existent wedding, in ways that were meant to be gentle inquiries, but carried the weight of judgment, and I had learned to deflect, to smile, to laugh, to say that I was focused on my career, on my work, on my friends, on anything that kept the spotlight off me, knowing all along that what my family wanted was a story that fit their version of success, and I was never part of that story because I didn't play by their rules, because I refused to let their version of timing dictate the value of my life. Sitting there, watching the expressions on their faces shift from confusion to shock, I felt a curious mix of fear and exhilaration, because I had crossed a line I had always imagined but never dared approach, a line where honesty collided with audacity, where the truth was served in such a simple package that it couldn't be denied, and yet it carried a weight that no one in that room was prepared to handle. My sister, who had always been so careful to polish every aspect of her life so that it reflected the image Mom and Dad wanted, now looked uncomfortable in a way I had rarely seen. Because suddenly the narrative that had always placed her above me was not absolute, and there was a silent acknowledgement that I had managed to claim a space they had never anticipated I could occupy. My father opened his mouth, then closed it again, probably searching for the words that could make sense of what I had just said, while my mother's hands trembled slightly as she held her wine glass, and I could see the tension in every muscle of her face, the disbelief at the audacity of the statement, and the challenge it represented. I wanted them to sit with that discomfort, to feel the ripple of uncertainty I had long carried myself, to understand for a moment that life does not only move forward in the ways they approve of, that success is not always visible to the naked eye, and that their favorite daughter was not the only one capable of creating meaningful, celebrated moments in life. Of course, I expected questions, incredulous looks, maybe even anger, but instead, there was silence, heavy and charged, the kind that makes you aware of every heartbeat, every breath, every second stretching out longer than it should. My sister finally cleared her throat, probably thinking that some kind of snide remark would restore the balance she assumed was always hers, but I just looked at her calmly, letting the weight of what I had said sink in, knowing that in that moment, I had won something that mattered far more than approval or praise. I had claimed my own truth in a room that had never allowed it, and the realization that my wedding, my milestone, whatever it looked like to me, had already happened, was mine. Alone, untouchable by judgment, untethered from expectation, and undeniable in its impact on those who thought they were in control. As the chatter around us slowly started again, stilted and careful, I could feel the subtle shifts in attention, the way people glanced at me differently, the way my sister's smile faltered, and I realized that this was only the beginning. That the ripple I had set in motion would grow, would complicate their assumptions, and would force them to reckon with a reality they had never truly considered. And in that quiet, tense victory, I felt a surge of satisfaction so intense that I knew I would never forget this moment, the first time I had disrupted the story they had written about me, the first time I had spoken and been heard in a way that left them speechless and, in some small, unspoken way, humbled. For years, I had perfected the art of living a life that my family couldn't see, a life that was carefully constructed not to impress anyone but to satisfy me. And while they had been busy measuring my worth by arbitrary milestones and comparing me to my sister at every turn, I had quietly built something that no one could touch or diminish, a career that demanded my complete attention, relationships that nourished rather than drained me, and a sense of independence that allowed me to move through the world without seeking permission or validation, and the irony of it all was that they had assumed I was stagnant, that I was waiting, watching, and failing to take the steps that mattered, when in reality, I had been orchestrating my own victories in ways they could never anticipate, and every promotion, every praise from colleagues, every project that succeeded against improbable odds was a silent rebellion against the narrative they had forced upon me, a proof that their definitions of success were narrow and their ability to see beyond their own favoritism was limited, and I reveled in that knowledge because it gave me an invisible power that I could wield whenever I chose, and there had never been a better time to exercise it than now. The truth was that my sister's wedding, the endless planning, the family adoration, the Instagram-worthy photos and curated moments had never held any real meaning for me. Not because I resented her happiness, but because I understood that their obsession with appearances and approval was a trap, and I had deliberately chosen to bypass it entirely, to create a version of life that I owned completely. A version where I was not performing, not competing, not existing in their shadows, and yet, every comment, every look, every question from my parents about when I would catch up or settle down had fueled a quiet determination to prove that I could define my own milestones, to show them that they had spent decades assessing the wrong daughter, applauding the wrong achievements, and framing their love and attention around an arbitrary, controllable narrative. And while the world outside my family might not have known about every small win, every personal accomplishment, I knew, and that knowledge was enough to sustain me and guide the decisions I was about to make, decisions that would disrupt the illusion of control they had long believed they held. I had built relationships that were deeper and more meaningful than the ones my family could comprehend, friendships that thrived on honesty, loyalty, and shared experience rather than superficial milestones or appearances. And I had learned to value myself without needing constant reinforcement from those who had repeatedly dismissed my worth, and in doing so, I had found a confidence that was dangerous in the best way. A confidence that made me untouchable in the very moments when they believed I was vulnerable, a confidence that allowed me to strategize, to anticipate their reactions, to manipulate situations with precision without cruelty, and to move through spaces like my parents' living room with the calm assurance of someone who had finally realized that their power over me was an illusion, a power that I could bend, redirect, and ultimately neutralize if I played my cards correctly, which I intended to do with patience, subtlety, and devastating effectiveness. The life I had built was not without effort or sacrifice, and there were moments when the loneliness of invisibility had weighed heavily on me, when I had questioned whether I would ever be recognized, appreciated, or understood by those who were supposed to love me unconditionally. But even those moments had served a purpose, sharpening my focus, honing my resilience, and teaching me that the only recognition that truly mattered was my own. That the only approval worth seeking was the one I could grant myself after every challenge, every decision, every success that required courage and foresight, and it was this quiet, self-earned authority that I carried into every family gathering, into every casual question about my future, into every subtle slight or underhanded compliment meant to remind me of my place, because I knew that they could never measure what I had achieved in the shadows, and that invisible dominance was far more potent than any public display they could muster. And so, when I left my apartment that morning, driving past the neighborhoods they had always assumed I would inhabit, attending meetings and making decisions that affected people who depended on my judgment and skill, I felt a sense of power that was almost intoxicating because I knew that while they were preoccupied with superficial ceremonies, with who wore what, who smiled the best, and who followed the script, I had already written my own story, a story that was real, meaningful, and entirely mine, a story that they had no access to and could not influence, and the thought of returning to their house, to the same questions, the same comparisons, the same assumptions, filled me not with dread but with anticipation, because I was armed with a truth they could not touch, a reality they could not deny, and I could see, in the way my sister's eyes flicked nervously toward me at family events, in the slight hesitation in my mother's voice when she tried to comment on my progress, that the first tremors of recognition had begun, that they were sensing that the version of me they had underestimated was not only capable but unstoppable, and that their careful hierarchy of favorites was quietly, irrevocably beginning to shift, whether they wanted to admit it or not. I had no intention of making a scene, of demanding attention, or of explaining myself in ways that would satisfy their need for control, but I allowed myself a small, private satisfaction in knowing that every understated success, every quiet triumph, every life choice made for me rather than for their approval was a seed of disruption, a promise that their comfortable assumptions about who they favored, who they valued, and who would always come last were about to be challenged, and when the moment came for them to understand the truth of what I had accomplished, the truth of who I had become, the shock would be worth every second of careful planning, every suppressed frustration, every moment of waiting for the perfect time to act. Because in that revelation, in that simple, undeniable exposure of reality, I would finally assert a victory that was mine alone, and it would be brilliant, satisfying, and utterly irreversible. It had been months since my sister's wedding, and the tension that hung over every family gathering was palpable, though unspoken, because I had planted a seed with my revelation that no one could ignore, a seed that grew in silence as they tried, futilely, to make sense of the fact that I had already celebrated a moment they assumed only existed in their imagination, and I had no intention of easing their discomfort, not because I wanted to hurt anyone unnecessarily, but because this was the first time in my life that I could reclaim control and assert my own timeline, my own achievements, and the knowledge that they had underestimated me for so long only strengthened my resolve to ensure that my next moves were precise, deliberate, and unforgettable. I had meticulously planned an event that mirrored the kind of celebration they prized, the kind of gathering they had expected me to host one day, but I had executed it entirely on my own terms, with no need for approval, no need for validation, and no need for them to be present, and I had documented it carefully, recorded memories, sent keepsakes to close friends and colleagues who understood the significance, and waited for the perfect moment to reveal what they could not have anticipated, knowing full well that when I chose to unveil it, the shock would be complete, visceral, and utterly satisfying. The invitations to my wedding had been sent discreetly, only to people whose presence mattered and who could appreciate the statement I was making, and I had avoided every family member who thrived on control, comparison, or hierarchy, because I had no intention of playing their game, and the knowledge that they were unaware of the event, the careful orchestration of every detail in my own private sphere, allowed me to feel a kind of quiet triumph that I had rarely experienced, a triumph born Not from arrogance, but from the clarity that for once, I had operated outside their expectations and had claimed a victory that was entirely mine, and the thought of the moment when I would finally confront them, when I would allow them to fully comprehend that their assumptions about my life were wrong, filled me with a sense of anticipation that was almost intoxicating, because it was not just about proving them wrong. It was about asserting my own agency in a way that no one could contest. When the family dinner arrived, and Mom once again began her carefully practiced line about my sister's wedding, complimenting every minor perfection and glancing at me as if to measure my reaction, I allowed the conversation to flow as if I were merely an observer, noting the subtle gestures, the way Dad's brow furrowed, the way my sister's smile faltered, and the way Mom's voice carried a hint of uncertainty that she could not mask, and then, at the precise moment when I knew the tension had reached its peak, I revealed the truth, casually, almost offhand, and yet deliberately, saying, "It already happened. You just weren't there," and the room froze, not because the words were shocking in their content, but because the delivery was perfect, calm, and impossibly controlled, a mirror of the confidence I had cultivated over months of careful planning. A confidence that left them unprepared, defenseless, and forced to reconcile their assumptions with a reality they could not ignore. The silence that followed was heavy with disbelief, the kind of disbelief that is tangible, the kind that twists familiar faces into expressions of confusion and discomfort, and I could see the immediate ripple effects in their body language. In the way my sister's hands tightened over her fork, in the way my mother's eyes shifted rapidly between astonishment and denial, in the way my father's jaw clenched as if he were trying to force his mind to accept something it had not been trained to process, and in that moment, I realized the power of the revelation was not in the event itself, but in the understanding that I had operated independently, deliberately, and brilliantly, while they had assumed control. While they had assumed visibility, and while they had assumed superiority, and the realization that I had achieved what they had long believed impossible for me gave me a satisfaction that was deeply personal, emotionally charged, and undeniably triumphant. Every glance, every question they tried to pose in the aftermath of my revelation was a test, a way to reclaim control, and I met each one with measured, calm, and absolute authority, refusing to bend, refusing to over-explain, refusing to yield an inch of the leverage I had gained, and I allowed the tension to build slowly, deliberately, like a wave rising before it crashes, knowing that the longer they struggled to process it, the more impactful the ultimate payoff would be, the more profound. The satisfaction of my strategic mastery, and the more unmistakable the truth that for once, I was not competing, I was not yielding, I was not existing in their shadow, and that the life I had built, the choices I had made, and the celebration I had orchestrated in private were mine alone, untouchable, and perfectly timed to deliver the shock and validation I had longed for. By the end of that evening, as they left the table with a mix of confusion, discomfort, and silent acknowledgement, I knew that this was only the beginning, that the seeds of disruption I had planted were taking root, and that every family gathering, every casual remark, and every expectation they had assumed about me was now under siege, and in that quiet, electrifying victory, I understood that my plan was unfolding exactly as I had envisioned, and the realization that the ultimate payoff was still ahead made me feel unstoppable, empowered, and ready for the next move, the one that would cement my control and redefine the way my family would see me forever. After the revelation at the dinner, I could sense that the subtle tremors I had set in motion were growing, and while my family had spent decades under the illusion that they were the architects of my life, that they could shape my decisions, control my milestones, and determine the narrative, I now moved in a world where the rules were mine, where every action I took was calculated, deliberate, and invisible until the precise moment it landed with maximum impact, and I had learned from long experience that the best victories were the ones that arrived unexpectedly, quietly dismantling assumptions before anyone realized what was happening, because the moment of realization, the moment when they finally understood that they had misjudged me, was far more satisfying than any confrontation, and I had honed the patience to wait for that moment while continuing to build, expand, and operate completely under the radar. The next family gathering approached, an event that had always been the stage for comparison, competition, and subtle judgments, and while they believed they were gathering to evaluate, measure, and categorize the children in terms of success, marriage, and life milestones, I knew that I had already redefined the criteria in ways they could not recognize, and I had arranged for small, precise revelations that would progressively dismantle the hierarchy they relied on, leaving them bewildered, unprepared, and powerless to reclaim the narrative, because I had taken the time to ensure that every detail was aligned, every domino placed so that the first movement would set off a chain reaction of realization, regret, and silent acknowledgement. And the planning for this sequence had taken weeks, a careful orchestration of information, appearances, and timing that I executed with patience, discipline, and an almost clinical attention to their predictable responses, and it was exhilarating. 2. Watch as the first signs of tension appeared, the slight hesitation in their smiles, the cautious way my sister spoke, the way my mother's eyes darted toward me seeking an explanation that I had no intention of providing until it served my purpose. In the early part of the evening, I allowed conversations to flow, measured my tone, chose my words to be harmless on the surface while loaded with implications beneath, and I watched as they tried to maintain control, as they attempted to insert commentary or comparisons that would remind them of their perceived superiority, and I responded not with defensiveness, not with confrontation, but with subtle confirmations of my independence. Statements of fact that they could not dispute, and careful references to the life I had built that they had been systematically blind to, and with each acknowledgement of something they had missed, their unease grew. An unease that was compounded when they began to recognize that their assumptions about my inactivity or stagnation were entirely wrong, and that the life I had constructed in the shadows was thriving in ways they had never anticipated. A life of real achievements, meaningful connections, and unassailable agency that no criticism, judgment, or comparison could undermine. I began to introduce more tangible signs of my success, subtle, almost incidental mentions of projects, investments, or opportunities that I had undertaken, each carefully phrased so that it appeared casual, yet each revelation carried weight. And I could feel their reactions before they even spoke, the way my father's jaw tightened, the way my sister's smile faltered, the way my mother's voice lost its confident lilt as she struggled to maintain authority, and every single gesture, pause, and question served to reinforce my growing control over the situation, because while they had spent decades dictating the pace and evaluating the worth of my life, I was now dictating the tempo, the information, and the emotional cadence. And the realization that I had seized this power quietly, without spectacle, without anger, without malice, made every subtle victory infinitely more satisfying, because it demonstrated an intelligence, a self-possession, and a strategic awareness that could not be dismissed or contested. By the end of the evening, the effect was undeniable. The assumptions, comparisons, and expectations that had defined our family interactions for years had been appended, and the small, deliberate moves I had executed were not obvious in isolation, but in combination, they created a pattern of control and achievement that my family could no longer ignore, a pattern that spoke volumes about my independence, intelligence, and capability. And as they left the gathering, quietly discussing, questioning, and reassessing, I allowed myself the satisfaction of knowing that I had once again turned the table without theatrics, without dramatics, simply through careful planning, awareness, and the quiet application of knowledge. And I understood that this was only a prelude, that the ultimate moment, the final, undeniable assertion of my triumph, was still ahead, and that when it came, it would leave no room for doubt, no room for justification, and no room for them to claim control ever again. Because I had proven, through precision, strategy, and patience, that my life, my milestones, and my choices belonged solely to me. I chose a regular Sunday dinner because it was the one setting where everyone felt most sure of themselves and most sure of me, and I walked in with a calm that was not accidental but earned. Carrying a thin folder I had kept in my bag for weeks while I waited for the exact moment when it would matter most, and after the predictable small talk and the usual pat on the back for my sister's perfect planning and perfect life and perfect everything, I asked for a few minutes without raising my voice or apologizing for taking up space, then laid the folder in the center of the table and told them I was going to say everything once, clearly and respectfully, and that whether they liked it or not, whether it fit the picture they had been carrying around for years or not, it was my life and it would be handled on my terms from now on. I said that the question about when it would be my turn had followed me since college like a sales pitch I never asked for, and that I had learned to smile through it because fighting with my own family over my worth never seemed like a good way to spend a holiday. But that the smile they took as compliance was actually a shield, and that behind it I had been building work I loved, friendships that did not drain me, a home I paid for myself without asking anyone for a dime, and a relationship with a man named Daniel who treated me with care and respect instead of performance and scorekeeping, and that when he asked me to marry him in a quiet moment that was ours alone, I said yes, and we went to the courthouse, and we signed, and we promised, and we celebrated with two friends who have shown up for years without a single condition attached, and that I did not tell my family because I was tired of hearing judgments dressed up as concern, because I was not interested in having a panel discussion about whether my choices were worthy of applause, and because I was done handing over my milestones as raw material for someone else's hierarchy. I pushed the first paper across the table and said it was a certified copy of the marriage certificate, that there was nothing scandalous or messy or dramatic about it, that there was no secret I planned to weaponize and no apology I owed. And then I held up my hand where the ring had been on a thin chain under my shirt for months, not because I was hiding it out of shame, but because I wanted it to live in a place where it was safe while I decided how to handle the fallout, and I explained that. The sentence I had dropped at the last dinner was not a trick line or a cry for attention. It was simply the truth told plainly to a group of people who had grown very comfortable expecting me to perform my life on their schedule, and that I had no interest in performing anything anymore. I said I knew there had been a so-called wedding fund mentioned like a carrot any time the conversation got awkward, and that whether it was real or a story meant to keep me on a leash, it did not matter, because I was not taking a cent. And then I passed the second document and told them it was a donation receipt made in our family name for a scholarship that will cover application fees and emergency costs for young women who are doing everything right and still being told they are behind, and that if they wanted their name on something, it could be on something that actually helped someone rather than on a scoreboard they used to keep me in my place, and I added, because I was done pretending otherwise, that this was not a stunt or a lecture. It was a boundary written in ink. I told them there would be no retroactive party, no staged photos to soothe anyone's reputation, no sudden rewrite to make it look like they were always in the loop, and that the only thing I was offering was an invitation to be in my life going forward under straightforward conditions that any respectful adult would welcome, which were that there would be no comparisons, no comments about my timeline, no jokes about my body or my choices, no ranking of daughters, and that if those conditions were too hard, then I would protect my peace and stay away without drama or debate, and I meant it. I said that I had timed a short post to go live while we were sitting there, not to embarrass them, but to remove the temptation to spin, because a clean public statement ends the whispering before it starts, and that the post simply said I married the person I love months ago in a private ceremony, that we are happy, that we are not accepting gifts, and that anyone who insists on measuring a woman's value by whether she puts on a costume and performs for the relatives can keep that metric and use it on themselves, and I promised that I would not read the comments, because I had already decided that internet applause was just another way to hand over control. I looked at my sister and said I was not interested in taking anything from her, that her wedding could stand on its own without needing my life to look smaller next to it. And I looked at my parents and said that if they wanted a relationship with me and with Daniel, then they would have one, and it could be relaxed and generous and adult. But if they wanted to keep the old script, they would be performing it alone. And I told them I was not angry anymore because anger suggests I am still waiting for something, and I am not waiting for anything, although I will admit that watching the realization move across their faces felt like justice, and I am not going to pretend otherwise just to make anyone comfortable. I stood, not to storm out or make a scene, but to end the meeting on time like any other meeting that has reached its conclusion, and my phone buzzed from the kitchen counter where I had left it face down, and my mother reached for it out of habit, and then stopped. Because even she understood in that second that the habit of reaching for my life without asking had expired, and my father tried to say something about family and tradition, and how this is not how things are done, and I said gently that it is exactly how things are done when a person refuses to be bullied by approval, and that if they wanted to be there for the next big thing they could learn the one lesson I had been spelling out for years, which is that I am not a project. I picked up the folder, left the copies on the table, kissed my mother's cheek because I am not out to scorch the earth, told my sister I hope she is happy and means it, told my father he raised a daughter who can read a contract and a room. And as I walked to the door, I repeated the line that started this whole thing, not as a jab, but as a closing statement that belonged to me, that my turn already happened and they just were not there, and if they wanted to be around for what comes next, they could show up without a script, and if they could not, then they would watch from a distance like everyone else, which is not cruel. It is simply the cost of underestimating someone who finally decided to speak.